For decades, one question haunted Elvis historians. Why did the FBI keep a 663-page classified file on a rock and roll singer? The official answer was simple: death threats, extortion attempts, the usual celebrity security concerns. But when those files were finally declassified, they revealed something nobody expected. December 22, 1970, the day after meeting President Nixon, Elvis Presley walked directly into FBI headquarters in Washington and made an extraordinary request to Director Edgar Hoover. He wanted to become a voluntary informant against communism and drug dealers. The memo, buried in FBI archives for decades, documented Elvis's exact words. He believed his long hair and flashy costumes gave him access to anti-establishment youth that government agents could never reach, and he wanted to use that access to warn kids about the dangers of communist propaganda and drugs. But Hoover refused to see him. The meeting never happened. Elvis was denied. What drove the king of rock and roll to desperately seek government approval? And what would have happened if they'd said yes? But to understand why Elvis became obsessed with fighting communism, we need to go back to where it all started, and a moment that would haunt him forever. If you're finding this story fascinating, please subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, and there's so much more to discover about the secrets hidden in Elvis's life. January 8, 1935, Tupelo, Mississippi. Elvis Aaron Presley was born in a two-room shotgun house, but he was supposed to be a twin. His brother Jesse Garin was delivered stillborn 35 minutes before Elvis took his first breath. Gladys Presley would tell Elvis throughout his childhood that he was living for two, that Jesse's spirit resided within him, that he had a sacred purpose to fulfill. This belief, this burden of dual destiny, would shape everything Elvis became, including his desperate need decades later to prove he was worthy of the life his brother never got to live. The poverty was crushing. Vernon cycled through jobs, served time for check fraud, and the family moved constantly. Elvis wore clothes sewn from flour sacks and went to bed hungry more nights than not. But Gladys made sure her boy attended the Assembly of God Church, where gospel music became his first language of emotion. In 1948, when the Presleys moved to Memphis, Elvis discovered the blues pouring out of Beale Street, music that was forbidden, dangerous, and absolutely essential to who he would become. But even as young Elvis was finding his voice, another voice was rising in America, one that would eventually pull him into its orbit, the voice of anti-communist paranoia. The year 1947 marked the beginning of America's second Red Scare. McCarthy rose to power, claiming communists were infiltrating every level of government. The Korean War exploded, bringing communism from abstract threat to visible enemy. By the time Elvis graduated high school in 1953, every American teenager had practiced duck-and-cover drills, preparing for Soviet nuclear bombs. This was the atmosphere young Elvis breathed, a nation convinced it was under siege from an invisible enemy. And into this paranoid landscape walked Elvis Presley in 1954, about to accidentally become the most controversial figure in American culture. On July 5, 1954, Elvis walked into Sun Studio and recorded "That's All Right," a sound that was neither country nor blues nor gospel, but somehow all three at once, delivered with an urgency and sexuality that made it impossible to ignore. When local DJ Dewey Phillips played it that night, listeners assumed the singer was black because no white singer had ever sounded like that before. Within 2 years, Elvis would be simultaneously the biggest star in America and its most dangerous threat. The Ed Sullivan Show appearance on September 9, 1956 became the flashpoint where entertainment and ideology collided, and where Elvis first realized his success had made him a weapon in a war he barely understood. Ed Sullivan had declared he would never have Elvis on his program because of vulgarity concerns. But when Elvis's ratings on a competing show exploded, Sullivan paid him $50,000, an unprecedented sum. That first appearance drew 60 million viewers. But CBS censors made a historic decision. Elvis would only be filmed from the waist up. America watched as Elvis sang with the camera pointedly excluding his lower body, creating an absence more provocative than any movement could have been. But here's the detail that changes everything. Backstage, Elvis met with FBI security consultants who'd been assigned to assess potential threats. This wasn't standard procedure, but Elvis was considered a security concern because the crowds he attracted were seen as potential sites of disorder, and in Cold War America, any mass gathering of youth was scrutinized for communist agitation. The FBI report from that night notes that Elvis expressed patriotic sentiments when questioned about his awareness of communist infiltration attempts in entertainment industry. Even at 21, Elvis was already being pulled into the ideological machinery of the Cold War, and that question would follow him to Germany, where his answer would begin to take shape in ways that would define the rest of his life. March 24, 1958. Elvis was drafted into the Army at the height of his fame. Colonel Parker recognized an opportunity to rebrand Elvis from dangerous rebel to all-American boy. Elvis served with humility, insisting on no special privileges. The press celebrated him as proof that even rebels would answer duty's call. But everything changed on August 14, 1958, when Gladys Presley died of heart failure at age 46. Elvis, granted emergency leave, arrived home too late. At the funeral, witnesses reported Elvis threw himself on his mother's coffin, sobbing uncontrollably, refusing to let them close it. The grief never left him, and here's where the story takes its first dark turn. At Fort Hood, after returning from his mother's funeral, Elvis was introduced to amphetamines by a sergeant who assured him the pills would help him function through grief. Elvis discovered the pills didn't just wake him up, they made him feel capable, like he could control the chaos inside him. This was the beginning of the addiction that would kill him 19 years later. Elvis's unit was deployed to Freiburg, West Germany, in October 1958, stationed as part of NATO forces facing the Iron Curtain, and it was there that everything changed. In Germany, Elvis was literally positioned on the front line of the Cold War, with Soviet-controlled East Germany just miles away. A captain in his unit gave him a book that would transform his worldview, Masters of Deceit by J. Edgar Hoover, published in 1958, which warned Americans about communist infiltration tactics. Elvis read it obsessively. He later told friends it was the first time he understood that the controversy around his music might not have been just moral panic. Maybe it was part of a larger pattern of cultural attack. Hoover's book argued that communists used entertainment and media to undermine American values, to make youth question authority. Elvis, who'd spent 2 years being called subversive despite his love for his country, suddenly had a framework that explained his persecution. He wasn't the enemy, he was the target. And if he could prove his loyalty, if he could turn his cultural power against the real enemy, he could redeem himself in the eyes of the America that had feared him. But Germany gave Elvis something else. Priscilla Beaulieu, the 14-year-old girl who would become his wife. When Priscilla walked into his party in September 1959, she was 14. Elvis was 24. Elvis was drawn to Priscilla's youth and innocence. He could shape her into the ideal woman who would never abandon him the way death had taken his mother. When Elvis returned to America in 1960, he never mentioned her publicly because even then he understood that discovery of his relationship with a 14-year-old girl would destroy everything his army service had rebuilt. The 60s would transform Elvis from rock star into Hollywood commodity. But beneath the surface, his obsession with proving his patriotism was growing into something consuming and strange. Parker steered Elvis away from live performances and into Hollywood, where he would spend 8 years making forgettable beach party musicals. Elvis hated these films, but Parker convinced him Hollywood legitimacy was worth more than artistic satisfaction. Privately, Elvis became increasingly fixated on loyalty, patriotism, and the communist threat. He collected books by conservative authors and began seeing patterns everywhere, in the anti-war movement, in drug culture, in increasingly radical music that challenged authority. Elvis believed America's youth were being deliberately corrupted, that the Cultural Revolution wasn't organic but orchestrated. When the Beatles arrived in America in 1964, Elvis saw proof of everything he feared. The Beatles seemed to transcend the establishment, creating a global youth movement that was explicitly countercultural. Elvis watched from Hollywood, making his 20th forgettable movie, as the band he'd inspired rendered him obsolete. In August 1965, when Elvis finally met the Beatles at his home, He lectured them about responsibility to fans, about not using fame to push dangerous ideas. John Lennon pushed back, asking Elvis when he'd stopped making real music. The meeting ended early. And in 1968, when his career was dying, Elvis made one last attempt to reclaim his crown, an attempt that would succeed artistically, but deepen his conviction that he had a mission beyond entertainment. The '68 comeback special, broadcast December 3, 1968, was conceived as a safe Christmas special, but director Steve Binder convinced Elvis to return to his roots: black leather, rock and roll, raw and dangerous. When Elvis performed If I Can Dream, addressing the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, critics declared him artistically reborn. The ratings were massive. Elvis had proven he could still matter. But the experience reinforced his belief that he had power, not just to entertain but to influence, to guide. And as the '60s ended with protests burning cities, he became convinced his influence needed to be deployed in service of something larger. Which brings us to 1970, and the bizarre sequence that would create one of the strangest documents in FBI history. December 1970. Elvis was performing successful Vegas shows but privately unraveling. His marriage to Priscilla was collapsing under his infidelities, drug use, and controlling behavior. Reading the newspaper one morning, Elvis saw an article on rising drug use among youth, connecting it to counterculture and anti-war protests. Elvis saw confirmation of everything Hoover had written: cultural attack, infiltration, the deliberate weakening of American youth. In that moment, Elvis decided he would volunteer his services to fight this attack. On December 19th, without telling anyone his full plan, Elvis boarded a red-eye flight to Washington, D.C., wearing a purple velvet cape, carrying $10,000 in cash and several handguns. During the flight, he wrote a letter to President Nixon on airline stationery, explaining his purpose. He understood youth culture in ways government agents couldn't. He could reach young people. He wanted to help fight drug abuse and communist propaganda, and he wanted Nixon to make him a federal agent at large, complete with badge and credentials. The meeting that resulted, captured in a now famous photograph of Nixon and Elvis shaking hands, was one of the strangest moments in presidential history. Elvis arrived at the White House gates on December 21st and handed over his letter, insisting it be personally delivered to Nixon. The Secret Service were baffled but recognized this was Elvis Presley, and that his letter represented a potential publicity opportunity for an administration struggling with youth opposition to Vietnam. Within hours, the meeting was arranged. According to declassified meeting notes, Elvis told Nixon that the Beatles had been a real force for anti-American spirit through drug promotion. He explained he'd studied communist brainwashing techniques and drug culture, that these were connected, that America's youth were being deliberately targeted. Elvis emphasized his appearance. Long hair, flashy clothes, rebellious image was actually his greatest asset in fighting this cultural war. Young people who'd never trust traditional authority would listen to him. Nixon was skeptical but intrigued. Here was Elvis Presley volunteering to become an anti-drug, anti-communist cultural warrior. So Nixon did something extraordinary. He granted Elvis's request, instructing officials to create a special agent badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Elvis beamed, holding the badge like a trophy, viewing this as one of his life's greatest achievements. But the meeting with Nixon wasn't enough, and what Elvis did next reveals the true depth of his obsession. The next day, December 22nd, Elvis went directly to FBI headquarters and requested a meeting with Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. The memo documenting this visit reveals the extraordinary request. Elvis wanted to formally register as a voluntary informant for the FBI, specifically to report on communist infiltration in entertainment and drug activity in music circles. Elvis told FBI officials he had access to parties and events where illegal activity was common, that he regularly encountered people involved in radical politics and drug distribution, and that he was willing to report this information in service of his country. He wanted official informant status. He wanted Hoover's acknowledgement, but J. Edgar Hoover refused to see him, and the FBI declined to register Elvis as an informant, a rejection that devastated Elvis and that he never fully accepted. The FBI memo explaining the decision is revealing. Officials noted that while Elvis appeared sincere in his patriotism, he had no experience in investigation. His celebrity status would make confidential information sharing impossible, and his known association with drug users made him unsuitable. Most damning, the memo noted that Elvis's motivation wasn't genuine desire to serve but rather a need for official recognition and validation of loyalty, due to lingering insecurity about his controversial early career. The FBI understood Elvis wasn't really trying to fight communism. He was trying to prove he wasn't the rebel everyone once feared. And so began Elvis's final descent, a 7-year spiral where his obsession with proving patriotism mixed with prescription drug addiction and paranoia. The Vegas years, from 1970 to 1977, were simultaneously Elvis's greatest commercial success and his most visible deterioration. He performed 2 shows per night, multiple weeks per year, earning millions. But backstage, the machinery of enabling was in full operation. Dr. George Nicopolis prescribed massive quantities of stimulants, depressants, painkillers, and sedatives. Elvis consumed uppers to perform, downers to sleep, painkillers to function, and by 1975 he was taking dozens of pills daily, his weight ballooning to nearly 300 pounds. But Elvis never saw himself as a drug addict. Because his drugs came from doctors with prescriptions, they were fundamentally different from street drugs. He convinced himself he was using medication, that his consumption was medical. This cognitive dissonance allowed Elvis to continue his anti-drug crusade even as he was killing himself with drugs. He collected law enforcement badges from multiple states, carried firearms constantly, and would occasionally pull over suspected drug dealers using police lights he'd installed in his personal cars. He saw no contradiction, and nowhere was this delusion more visible than in the disaster of his final concert tour in 1977. By June 1977, Elvis was dying and everyone knew it except Elvis himself. His weight fluctuated wildly. His colon was distended from years of opioid-induced constipation. His heart struggled under the burden of stimulants and obesity. But Parker had booked a tour, and Elvis insisted he could perform. The tour was catastrophic. Elvis forgot lyrics mid-song, stopped performances to ramble incoherently, struggled to move under the weight of sweat-soaked jumpsuits, and on June 26, 1977, in Indianapolis at Market Square Arena, Elvis gave his final concert, a performance so troubling that even devoted fans knew they were watching something terrible. Elvis was bloated, moving with visible pain. His voice struggled to hit notes that used to come effortlessly. He performed "Are You Lonesome Tonight" and forgot the words entirely, standing silent while the band played. But he finished that show, took his bows to the standing ovation that came from love rather than merit, never knowing he would never perform again. The final 7 weeks revealed just how completely his mission-driven identity had consumed him, even as his body failed. Elvis spent hours reading law enforcement magazines, studying FBI bulletins, discussing with bodyguards how they would fight crime together once he recovered. He showed visitors his collection of police badges from 40 jurisdictions, explaining what each authorized him to do. He talked constantly about the work he would do, the drug dealers he would help arrest, the kids he would save from communist influence. It was fantasy, the last desperate attempt of a dying man to believe his life had meant something beyond entertainment. On the morning of August 16, 1977, Elvis spent hours in the bathroom at Graceland, trying to relieve the constipation that had plagued him for years. The straining combined with the drugs in his system created perfect conditions for cardiac arrest. His girlfriend Ginger Alden found him on the bathroom floor around 2 p.m., his face pressed into the carpet, his body already cooling. Elvis Aaron Presley was dead at 42. The autopsy, kept sealed for 50 years by court order, reportedly showed 14 different drugs in his system, though the official cause was listed as cardiac arrhythmia to protect his reputation. The king of rock and roll died on the bathroom floor, surrounded by pill bottles, wearing a federal narcotics agent badge, having spent his final years trying to prove he was something he'd never needed to be. In the days after Elvis's death, 50,000 fans gathered at Graceland to mourn. and the FBI received hundreds of letters demanding to know what role the Bureau had played in Elvis's life. The FBI released a brief statement confirming Elvis had requested to assist the Bureau but had never been formally utilized. When the 663-page file was finally released years later, it revealed not the story of a secret agent, but of a profoundly insecure man who'd spent his final decade seeking validation from the establishment that had once feared him. Elvis Presley was never a communist threat. He was never even particularly political. He was a poor kid from Mississippi who became famous for challenging social norms, who spent the rest of his life trying to prove that challenge wasn't betrayal, who convinced himself that patriotic service could redeem whatever sins he thought he'd committed by gyrating on television in 1956. He wanted to fight communism because fighting it proved loyalty. He wanted to battle drug dealers because it proved he wasn't an addict. He wanted badges and credentials because they proved he was acceptable, respectable, safe. But Elvis Presley never needed redemption because he'd never actually done anything wrong except be talented and sexual, and dangerous at exactly the moment American culture needed someone to be those things. Today, more than 45 years after his death, over 1 billion Elvis records have been sold worldwide. Graceland receives more than 600,000 visitors annually. His music remains culturally ubiquitous, his image iconic, his influence undeniable, and the FBI file that once seemed so mysterious is now recognized for what it actually documents. Not the story of Elvis the secret agent, but the story of Elvis the eternally insecure boy from Tupelo who changed everything and never believed he was good enough. His obsession with fighting communism and proving loyalty was tragic not because it was political, but because it was personal. A decades-long attempt to answer critics who'd stopped criticizing him years before. To prove something that never needed proving. In the end, Elvis's secret government files don't reveal a hidden warrior. They reveal a superstar who was, underneath everything, still the scared poor kid trying to prove he deserved to survive when his twin brother didn't, trying to justify the life he'd been given, trying to make sense of fame that came too fast and cost too much, and never quite felt real. And if there's a lesson in Elvis's tragic pursuit of patriotic validation, it's this: the establishment you're trying to join will never value you as much as the culture you already changed.